Hey guys, you're listening to episode 186 of the Finish Line podcast, where we discuss the intersection of faith, generosity, and personal finance. My name is Keelan, and I'm here with my co-host and brother Cody. What does generosity look like when it's shaped by both pain and joy? That's what we talk about with today's guest, Teri Bledsoe. Teri's an entrepreneur and board chair with Women Doing Well. Her story is one of deep faith, hard seasons, and a growing conviction that God never wastes what He allows. Through adoption, foster care, motherhood, and business, God has shaped her heart in a way to help women live with purpose, courage, and open-handed generosity. In this conversation, we talk about how calling is clarified in suffering, how joy can endure in hard places, and how generosity becomes a way of life that touches every part of our story. If you've ever wondered how God can use your hardest seasons for kingdom good, this conversation will encourage you. Before we get started, you know we've spent years talking to and learning from some of the most passionate givers and leaders in the world. We've distilled down some of the most impactful frameworks, strategies, and tools into short weekly emails that leave you with practical ways you can take your generosity journey to the next level. If you aren't on our list already, you can sign up for free at finishlinepledge.com. And with that, let's get started. We are excited to have Julie Wilson from Women Doing Well guest hosting with us again today. Julie, thanks so much for being with us.
Love being with you guys. Thanks for having me.
And we are very excited to welcome Teri Bledsoe with us today. Teri, we're excited to have you with us.
I'm so excited to be here. This is so fun to be a part of this movement.
All right. Well, why don't you just kick us off? Take us back to some of your early years. What was home like growing up for you?
Okay, I was born in Texas, in Fort Worth, and we lived there until second grade. And then we moved to Atlanta, and I was raised my whole rest of my life in Atlanta. I was raised in a Christian home. My father was in sales, so he traveled a good bit. So my mother always took us to church. When my dad was in town, when he was home, he went to church with us. They were not necessarily involved in church, but we always went to church and Sunday school. And from a very young age, I loved to read. I was a voracious reader, and I just loved the Bible. And I loved to go to church. And I can remember asking the Lord into my heart when I was 5. And I went to my parents and said, I want to ask Jesus into my heart. And they said, no, you're too young. We want you to wait. And I thought, no, Jesus says that I can do this. And so I remember kneeling in front of my dryer because the laundry room was the only place in my house I had privacy, I guess, and asking the Lord to come into my heart. And I knew when I stood up as a 5-year-old little girl, I knew there had been a shift in my heart. And from that point on, I loved to go to church. I loved to read God's word. I was rebellious in every normal way, I guess. But there was just this deep knowing, even as a child, that His word was true and I could trust Him. So I grew up in church and met my husband when I was a senior in high school, Chris. He was a senior in college. And so I was going to be a pediatric oncologist. So I wasn't looking for a boyfriend or even a husband, of course. But almost immediately I felt the Lord tell me, this is going to be your husband. And I know you have these set of plans, but if you'll trust me, I have another set of plans. And this was back in the 80s when a lot of affirmative action was just beginning with women. And I actually had a full scholarship to University of Tennessee for pre-med. And I broke my daddy's heart when I fell in love with a Georgia boy and said, Dad, I'm not going to University of Tennessee. I'm going to Georgia. And he said, well, you can go to Georgia, but you have to pay for it. Because I was the oldest of 3, so there was 2 more behind me. And the scholarship, obviously, the UT would have been my way to pay for it. So I said, okay. So I just started working and tried to get scholarships, got several scholarships at Georgia, academic scholarships. And through that, God always provided what I needed, usually not ahead of time, but I was tithing even as a high schooler. And that was not anything my parents made us do. In fact, I don't really recall talking about tithing with my family. It was something that it was always this overflow of gratitude, even as a child. And I think it was profound in God laying down some habits in my heart before I had anything, that it was just going to be part of our relationship, that He would give, and out of my gratitude, I would give back.
It's really interesting that you mention this commitment to giving from such an early age. Where was generosity modeled for you as a child?
My mother's mother, so my maternal grandmother, was probably the most generous woman I ever knew. And this is a woman who had nothing. My grandfather was an alcoholic and she could sew. And so she would make dresses, prom dresses, pageant dresses, wedding dresses for the ladies in the church. But she was the most committed, faithful, real woman of generosity. She could take a meal to someone out of, you would look in her refrigerator and not think she had any food, and there would be this humongous meal for someone in need. And so these were not big shows of generosity. They were what we call as you go shows. It was just out of whatever she had, and the Lord multiplied. And if there was a need, if someone's house burned down, if someone needed something, she was always right there. And the Lord seemed to provide through her. And it wasn't even through her access. It was sometimes through her sacrifice. And my mother says she does not remember having store-bought clothes until she was in middle school, like in junior high. And so my grandmother, she would go and get like clothes at the throwaway or the thrift and remake them, the fabric. So I think she modeled to me generosity before I knew what it was, and just a commitment to sharing God's love with whatever she had.
Now, as you and Chris were kind of getting launched together into the real world, so to say, how did faith kind of set a foundation at that stage? What did that look like together, and how did that start playing out?
Well, Chris was raised Catholic, and I was raised Southern Baptist from the womb. And Chris had come to know the Lord at a vacation Bible school in third grade. So he was a believer. And my parents very wisely said to me, you don't try to change him, and he won't try to change you. And let the goodness and the love of the Lord woo him. You don't need to get in there and be a Holy Spirit helper. And so my job was to pray. And so the first couple of years of our marriage, we went to both Catholic Mass and to Sunday school and church every Sunday. And we had Whitney, our oldest. We'd been married about 4 months and I got pregnant with her. So what happened, the way the Lord just sort of worked in our life, was the Baptist church had this little Sunday school, and it had her name on the desk, and the lady knew her, and every week she wanted to go. And at the Catholic church at the time, it was just this sort of big free-for-all nursery. So it just became a natural, easier to take her to the Baptist church because she was happy there and she wouldn't cry when we left her. And so I think the Lord used very practical ways of wooing us as a family. The other thing was we had a lot of young couples in Sunday school, and we began doing Bible study because it was social and there was childcare. And I was a believer and he was a believer. So it worked. It was never an issue. And it was just a very organic leaning towards, at that time, that community. And we began growing, doing Bible study together, learning to pray together as a couple. We were not giving yet. I was always giving, but we were not tithing. And I had had a surgery and had a hysterectomy when Whitney was about 18 months old. So we had some pretty significant medical bills. And at the time, I remember Chris had been out of town. He was an accountant, an auditor, and he had been on an audit for about 2 weeks. And I had felt the Lord say to me, I want you to test me on my goodness. And I didn't tell Chris. This was not a great marital moment on my part, but this is very true. So that week, I felt the Lord saying, Malachi 3:10, bring it all into the storehouse and test me on this. And so I had just enough. Our tithe was about what our house payment was. So I went ahead and tithed and didn't tell Chris. And he's an accountant. I need to go ahead and punctuate that. And then I just said, okay, Lord, you've got a week because he'll be home on Friday. And every day I was just like, okay, Lord, this is our house payment. So I've done what you've asked. And on Friday in the mail came a check, an insurance overpayment to the exact dollar of what my tithe was, which also was the amount of our house payment. And when he got home, I was so remorseful for stepping outside of his leadership. I was young. I'm a little bit of a rebel but the Lord had proven to me in that act exactly who he was. And I think it was the beginning of a foundation of what he was going to do in our lives. Chris asked me to never do that again, which I thought was fair. But also, it was not lost on him what God was showing us and doing us. And so we together at that point began tithing. And it was at first $10 a week. And then we would increase $20. And I would ask the Lord to show us ways till we could honor him with our tithe. And it was probably about 2 years before we could work that into a budget with a young baby. But that day and that situation 40 years later, it is as real to me as it was that day. And so that's how God used the tithing to begin our generosity journey and really just showing us who he was.
Teri, I remember when we first met, we were all at dinner and Chris said something like, yeah, she's pretty much supported me my whole life. It's my turn to support her in a missional way. Will you say more about what that journey's looked like?
Yes. So when we began having children, I had a hysterectomy when Whitney was 18 months old, and we wanted to grow our family through adoption. And so it was at that point I was working, but we decided that I would stay home. And in staying home, I was really laying down all my aspirations and passions and dreams so that I could raise these children, which was a greater joy, but it was still a sacrifice. And so for years, I would support him, in whatever his endeavors were. And he was the one on boards, and he was the one because he had the professional career and he was an entrepreneur. And so the day that he had his first exit, he said to me, you have supported me and emotionally and, with his activities. And he said, and now I want to give back to you. So it's not about the money. It's about the time. And so now he is actually, we tease him, and I'm not sure this is appropriate, but we call him, he says he is the man doing the women well. So he takes care of us at Women Doing Well. He drives the van to pick up all the girls at the airport at our patron events. He does all the things in the background for me. He travels with us and he'll entertain the other husbands and the other guys that come because he's so passionate about me and about what God is using me for. But for years, it was the flip. He was on all the boards and all the leadership, and I would have everyone over, I would cook the meals, I would do whatever. And so this has been a really powerful time of receiving for me in our marriage. Plus, he's a lot of fun. So the women at Women Doing Well really love him.
We sure do.
Teri, the story you shared about the insurance overpayment, it's so fascinating to think through. The most likely scenario is that insurance overpayment was made long before you decided to actually give that week. And God knew what was going to happen ahead of time, and he planned something to build your faith as a result. And I'm curious, as you navigated life and as you had different seasons where maybe it didn't feel like you had enough and seasons where you maybe had more than enough, how did you continue to stretch in your faith?
Oh, Cody, I love that you brought that out because Psalms 27:8, the psalmist says, God says, you say, seek my face. But my heart says, God, it is your face that I seek. And that has been the premise of my life, is that he initiates and we get to respond. And that is exactly, to me, the weight of that insurance check incident. It was cool and coincidental and providential that it was the same number. But the real message was that God of the universe was talking to me and saying, I see you, and I'm going to move heaven and earth so that you don't miss an opportunity to respond to my goodness and my love. I never get over it. And my whole life has been a response. And that's what I think generosity is. It's a response of gratitude to who he is and what he shows us of his character and his love and his grace in this world. And I know you asked me another part of that, but I kind of got hung on who he was. So you can ask me the second part again.
Well, one of the things that's interesting about that whole experience, and also I'll just point out, we have had a surprising number of people share a very similar version to that story. Like, this is one God who is interacting with all of us in such complex ways in drawing us close to him. And, the prosperity gospel always comes up at some point and people say like, I'm not, talking about the prosperity. And I think what you were just saying there is so key, that the point actually has nothing to do with the money that you got back. It's the fact that the way that God orchestrated that made it so clear that the God of the universe was intimately involved in your day-to-day life, the little decisions that you're making and trying to figure out with your husband. And that's what's so powerful about it. And I think that's true across, the whole scope of generosity, is that, dollars and numbers and stuff are important, but what's actually so powerful about generosity is we get to see and interact. It's like a language of speaking with God, and something that we would totally miss out on if we didn't step out, in the way that you did right there, and get to see him just respond over and over. So I love that story, and it just so concisely captures such a powerful dynamic of how I think God works through generosity. Now, you mentioned your husband going through a business exit. That certainly is kind of a life-changing event in terms of everything kind of being thrown up in the air and having to make a whole bunch of new decisions again. And I'd love if you can kind of walk us through what was that season like, coming from this foundation early in your marriage and some powerful faith experiences. What did that look like as, the numbers started to change?
Yeah. So I want to lay a little bit of history here because I think it's important. So Chris was an accountant and I had this hysterectomy. And when we were in the hospital, Whitney, our oldest daughter, was 18 months old. We had a couple come visit us in the hospital when I'd had the surgery. And that day, the Lord had laid on my heart that he was going to continue to grow our family, which obviously biologically was not possible anymore. And this couple came that night, just showed up at our hospital room and said the Lord had sent them to tell us a story about their adoption. And they had at the time adopted 2 children. And this was back in the late 80s, early 90s, when the adoption letters, you would get a private attorney and you would send out letters to everybody you knew to see if there was a crisis pregnancy. And so I had heard of this process, but I had not met anyone that had done that. So we left that hospital feeling like God was going to continue to grow our family. So then fast forward, we have this little testing event that the Lord nailed down exactly who he was to us. But the way that we sort of processed that was an invitation. He was inviting us in to his circle of care. And I didn't have those words then. I just knew that that activity was an invitation to walk with him and be on mission with him. And so Chris was an accountant and he was very rapidly, getting promoted and was hired by his largest client, which was United Community Banks in Blairsville, Georgia. So we packed up and moved to Blairsville. And at Blairsville, he was the CFO of United Community Banks and did 28 acquisitions in 5 years, which was the speed of light. And by that time, we had adopted a baby, Christopher, our oldest son, and he was just gone all the time. And we had moved to the mountains to have some sort of quality of life. And with the speed of the success of the business, that evaporated. And so we just began praying, Lord, you've made us parents. You've given us these gifts of these children. You've got to have a provision for their dad to be around. And so we made the decision to move back to Atlanta, and he would start. At first, he was just going to do rent a CFO, and he figured out he needed 10 banks and he could be a CFO. And working at United Community and having those experiences at that time in the community banking business, everybody wanted to grow and sell. And so he did that. And then he started from that, the rent a CFO, he started Banker's Dashboard. And during the time we were still in Blairsville, we had gone on to adopt 2 more children. They were our foster children first, Hannah and Daniel. So we moved back to Atlanta, a family of 6, 4 kids, and he began this entrepreneurial opportunity with the Rent a CFO, which then he realized he could do the software and kind of create a financial dashboard in the cloud before the cloud was a cloud. Now the cloud's not a cloud anymore, but dashboard is still there. And so we had dashboard for 11 years, and then he sold it. So the income, and the reason I give you the backstory is we were very middle class and had chosen to move to the mountains for a slower life and definitely a cheaper lifestyle than when you lived in the city. And so we were good at making much out of little. And as his income began to grow with Dashboard, we were giving and giving, but we had already, that foundation and that discipline of generosity was firm. And, it could be giving away uniforms. It could be working in the food pantry. So these weren't huge. We weren't sitting on boards and giving away out of a family foundation yet. We were giving out of what we had, which was the way that we both had been raised. And so when he sold Dashboard, our biggest fear was we would ruin the kids with the wealth, because we literally went to bed and our income had continued to rise, but not at the rate of an exit. And the neat story is when he and his partner started Dashboard, they both on a napkin individually wrote down a number and said, if we ever get an offer at this, then we'll sell it. And they both wrote down the same number. And 11 years later, God orchestrated the sale for the exact number that they both had written down. So I think Chris has the spiritual gift of wealth generation. And I think there's an equipping and a knowing there. And for me, I think my heart for generosity is a beautiful complement to that. Chris is incredibly generous. But I think when we sold the company, we realized that money was not for our consumption. It was God's money. It was God's kingdom. And we were just going to be conduits. And at the exact same time of the sale, our oldest son, Christopher, who was adopted, started going through some addiction issues as a senior in high school. And we pretty quickly had to get him into a treatment center. So you have this amazing life wealth event, and it's from God, and you're scared to death, but you're excited, but it's all the things. And then at the exact same time, we have our oldest son going into treatment, and it's a very scary time as a parent. And so those tracks of joy and sorrow, as Watchman Nee says, they were just running straight parallel. And the only thing we knew was that God was big enough that if he allowed these problems with Christopher, that he would have a provision. And the only other thing we knew was we had to be so yielded and surrendered to this new wealth event, because we had never seen anything good, to a family come into money. And so we were very scared. And so for 2 years, we didn't do anything. That was our advice, to just take a pause. We had started to be introduced to people that would, shepherd us and mentor us. I Googled, this is so funny, and this was before Google was really popular, but one morning I got up and Googled strategic kingdom giving, and the gathering came up. And Fred Smith's phone number actually was in the gathering description. So I called him. It was before Sunday school one morning, and I just said, we need some help. We've had this exit, and we're givers, and we know Jesus, and we know this isn't for us, but we don't know what to do with it. It was almost like hot potato, like, no, you take it, And even though Chris is a financial person, this was God's money. And Fred said, we're having, our gathering event in September. Why don't you guys come? And so we did. So God had a provision for us even before we knew to ask for it, and in community. We also, our financial advisors, the first thing they said we needed to do was meet Boyd Bailey here in Atlanta. And Boyd and Rita now have been our best friends for 11 years. But Boyd was so generous to just love us and guide us with a different perspective on kingdom giving. And it's been a gift.
Gary, I think there's something really significant about that back of the napkin decision, that if God ever provided an opportunity for the business to be sold for a specific amount, that is answering the question, how much is enough, which is such a core theme on this podcast, in my own life, of understanding that there is a limit to how much we actually need. And without that decision, even if it seemed arbitrary and not a binding contract, to have that defined actually can set you free, because without answering that question, there's always the justification for more. And sometimes it can stray you from something that God might be calling you into, like spending more time with your kids or just something other than what you're focused on. So I think there's a lot of significance around that. And I'm curious because having a lot of kids in your home has been such a significant part of your journey. How did you and Chris start to balance this on the other side of selling the business?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, we moved back to Atlanta because he had missed so many little league practices and, gymnastics events and the things, cheerleading. So he said, when we move back to Atlanta, we are structuring our professional life, meaning his, because I was at home with the kids, so that I can coach football, so that I can be at every dance recital, so that I can, take half the load of taking these kids in the afternoons to their practices and their activities. And so he structured Dashboard that way. He left every day at 3:00. Looking back now, I'm sure there was not the temptation, but the opportunity to have one more call at 4:00, one more call but he every day, and his employees every day, they could leave and go be with their kids. And I think he's not on the show tonight, but I think he would say that was something between him and the Lord, because his father, he grew up with a very involved father. And this was going against, I think, a personal value of his, of the way he wanted to parent and raise his children. So when we moved back to Atlanta, he was there he coached every sport for Christopher. Dan was a tennis player, and so he couldn't coach tennis, but he was at every practice, every match, not to hover, but to enter into their joy and to show support. And I think also when we sold Dashboard, he wasn't in this fury to get something else, So you're right. We did have a finish line, and we didn't have it probably, Cody, articulated. Like there wasn't this dollar amount that we said, we are only going to do this. The way we did it was, God, it's all yours. Every single penny of it. You give us enough, to raise these kids, and you can have all of it. And we began giving, and really the gathering took what I would say our spiritual discipline of tithing and offering and took it to the next level. What that community did was show us this secret of generosity, that there is joy in generosity beyond the joy of honoring, trusting, and obeying the Lord in what he's called us to do biblically, right? And Chris will tell you his favorite class at the very first gathering was all the mistakes, like the biggest mistakes I ever made in giving. But I think that again was like another foundational opportunity for us, because we learned right away this was not going to be about how we could do it just right. It was going to be with what God did it with generosity along the way. And to this day, and it's interesting now that I'm with Women Doing Well, 6% of women feel confident in their giving. My passion is to say, have 100% confidence in God, and he'll take care of whatever giving mistakes you might make. So it became really quickly with us, we understood that this wasn't an outcome-based exercise in the kingdom. This was an intimacy and relational exercise with the King, and he owned it all, and he didn't even need us to make sure it was a good investment. He was inviting us in. And I think that's, for me, the reason invitation is so important, is because God invited us. He could have picked anybody to do any of that. And he invited us in. And I never get over that. The gratitude and just the love and the opportunity to partner with him and to mirror his love and generosity to the world.
So Teri, you mentioned, I think very wisely, waiting 2 years to really kind of start moving a lot of things around. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, in kind of giving yourself time to process and grow without forcing yourself into rapid decisions. Then it sounds like the gathering was really catalytic in helping you guys kind of form a plan, a strategy, a direction. And I don't know if you remember during that season, what did that plan start to take shape as? What were even some of the early things that you guys together were like, we want to shape our journey going forward like this or that? What stood out from that season?
Yeah, I would say to this second, we have sort of interfamily dialogue. We say it's the 6 degrees of the gathering, that's just the vehicle the Lord uses in our life. When we are going to the gathering every year, it is definitely kingdom continuing education. I think what we saw was that this was activity of God. And there's these other families, and some of them were really big names that you would know those family offices. But the other cool thing was about this time, the Donor Advice Fund was just kind of launching and getting some traction. And Terry Parker, of course, with NCF was here in Atlanta. So we immediately, they introduced us. I think the first year we went, we were one of 2 new families to the gathering. So this was still sort of a tight-knit group back then. And so they were trying to connect us with Atlanta families. And Chris is an accountant. And so he was trying to decide, do we spend the money for a family office, or with this new DAF, the Donor Advice Fund, could we take the money that we would spend administrating a family fund and give more away? And that became exciting to us because we were talking to other families that were actually, 3rd and 4th generation. And a lot of the families within the gathering were exploring donor advised funds. And they were also taking these family offices and converting, if not the whole office, parts of the office of their family office giving into donor advised funds. And Chris got really excited about that because as an accountant and someone in finance, he figured out real quickly we had a lot more money we could give away if we weren't paying to administer a family office. So that was the way the Lord sort of led us. And the other thing, he was very, not just convicted, but he absolutely knew that he knew, was that we would not consume this money. The Lord would bless us and we would enjoy the bounty of the Lord, but it was not for our consumption. And so we had always lived on a budget, a family, with 4 kids, and we would continue that. And honestly, through the years, it's been a comfort to me, not from a security standpoint, but just because it was such an ingrained lifestyle. And so right away, Chris set this finish line, this budget for us that we would live on. And you have to understand at the exact same time, we're incurring treatment bills that we had never had before with a child that was in addiction. And then very shortly after that, our second daughter, Hannah, we realized that she was having a mental health crisis herself. And it was becoming obvious that she had adolescent onset bipolar. And so we had Christopher in a treatment plan in California, and we had to have Hannah placed in a treatment center in California. And so now we have 2 of the 4 children in treatment. And so there wasn't a lot of opportunity to spend this money on pleasure because we were in crisis. So I think early on, the Lord structured our hearts that we knew that we would use the money for giving and not for consuming, but also the money was there to care for the children. And that has been true through the years. And so our giving plan, we met some families at the gathering and we had some really great advice there. And that was start with 3 areas. Start with something local, it's ACTS, right? Start with something local, something national, and something global. And that felt manageable to us. And so that's exactly, we just started praying. We had taught, and Henry Blackaby's Experiencing God several years as a couple in our discipleship classes at church. And so we said, okay, Lord, we just would like to see where you're at work and we would like to join you. This whole journey of generosity has been an invitation by you to us. And so we're just going to go with that. And the way that the Lord responded to us was he put opportunities in front of us. We started working with ministries for Christian parents because we were obviously walking through that. And then we got involved with Pine Cove Christian camps. And then Chris, as an entrepreneur, was always passionate about church planting. And so we got involved with, at the time, it was just becoming city to city, but it was Tim Keller's Redeemer Presbyterian Church out of New York, their sending arm, which is now city to city. And it would be just things we learned about at the gathering. It would be, invitations from people that knew somebody that thought that maybe we would want to meet them. And so it was just as organic as that. And every year we would go to the gathering and there would be ministries that they would just be sharing what God was doing in their ministry. There would be families that we would migrate to, or maybe have an opportunity to get to know, and the things that they were doing. It would be inspiring to us. It would be educational to us from a kingdom giving perspective. And so the way that the Lord did it was all different ways. And I think that was showing us the intimacy of generosity, right? Like there's not one prescribed way to be generous in God's kingdom. So that is how we developed it. The other thing Chris was absolutely adamant about was that we set a spending amount at the beginning of the year that we would give away. And then we would leave it to the Lord to fill in the checks. We would prayerfully every year set an amount. And most years, even to this day, we pick the same amount. And it's a different amount every year, but it's the unity that we ask the Lord for in that decision. It continues to be a blessing to us that you can't outgive God. So to me, the intimacy that God has created between Chris and I and himself in this generosity, and the joy, the absolute fullness of joy that he has given us through generosity, they've been the only thing this side of heaven that can counterbalance the sorrow and some of the pain we've been through. So we have this amount that we prayerfully decide with the Lord every year to give away. And then the largest part we do together, which is usually about 70%, 60%. And then Chris has 20% and I have 20%. I blow mine always really quickly. And he's so generous. He usually gives me a little extra to give away. But the thing that we have found is that those 20% that we get to share with each other, how God is burdening our heart, how he's breaking our heart, things that we're passionate about, the ways that he's transforming passions inside of us and meeting needs, that has created the deepest sense of intimacy and community and respect between the two of us. I'm continually like just falling in love all over again with Chris when I see him get burdened for a kingdom cause. And people say when you have all the money, money doesn't make you happy, but, it can help you buy things that make you happy. Well, the thing that I would say is that wealth event, the thing the Holy Spirit did was give us unity and a deep sense of joy with each other, to see each other in ways that we might not have ever seen each other. And so each year, that's what we do. And it's very prescriptive, and the amounts differ year to year based on the market, based on our family needs. But that has been such an incredible, God is the God of the overflow, right? If you had said to me, Teri, your greatest joy of giving is going to be what God does between you and Chris, I don't know that I would have believed that. I would have thought it would have been the joy of watching somebody else, but the way that God has given us an intimacy, especially after 40 years of marriage, it's a high. It is. You talk about mining for joy, which Chris and I, that is our passion. I love it. I love to hear where Chris wants to give. And I love when God uses us as a couple to give. So that's our giving plan. We also have some spontaneous giving that we do, which is fun. And there's no set amount for that. It's usually just opportunities God brings us outside of these big amounts. Sometimes we give to just one organization and sometimes we give to multiple. So that part changes. But I think the steady part of our giving plan is that there'll be unity of spirit between the two of us. There'll be joy and there'll be intimacy. And again, you cannot outgive God. And I always tell women, if you want to do something sexy, start giving, enter into generosity with your husband, because you'll see sides of him that you may not see otherwise.
Teri, you said such an interesting line that really has captured my imagination. I want to understand more. When you say mining for joy, what does that look like practically?
Practically, we have walked through some pretty significant loss in our lives. We lost our oldest son, Christopher, who I mentioned earlier, 2.5 years ago, to a fentanyl-laced overdose. And prior to that, he had been in recovery for about 3.5 years, and he had had a relapse. So through the 10 years of his addiction, I realized that walking through addiction with a child and then having significant mental illness with our other two younger children, that joy was it was a little bit hard to come by. And so I began asking God, Lord, there's got to be more. And we're giving, and I'm realizing that we are having joy through generosity in the relationships that God cultivated, in the intimacy with Him as we're, on mission with Him for the kingdom. And I just began mining. I just said, Lord, you tell us that you give us Zoe life to the full, and I'm mining for it. I'm asking you, I will wrestle you. I'll walk with a limp, but I won't let go until you show me your joy. And it was through those years of suffering and loss that the joy of giving and being on mission with the Lord, and also Chris and I having a kingdom mission bigger than even our temporal mission of parenting, that the Lord showed me that special grace and that deeper joy and that kingdom secret of, you gain it all when you give it away. And you get what you specifically gain is the joy of the Lord. And Jesus tells us in John, where God says, I've given you my joy. And Jesus says to us that He gives us His joy to the full. And the people that God put us in community with, maybe we were sitting on a board, so maybe it was an executive director, maybe it was just the other board members, the recipients of the ministry, those relationships, God was providing so much joy and fulfillment that it was actually the only counterbalance to the suffering. It kept our eyes off of ourselves and still on to God. And He's always out giving and always out loving. And that's where I really understood that to mine for joy really is just to continually be looking for opportunities for generosity. Your time, your talent, your treasure. And I always throw these extra two in because I always say women love a buy one, get one, your tithes and your testimony. So when you're mining for joy, you are looking at those 5 areas of your life and you are intentionally, and it is okay biblically to give to get more of God. That is 100%, I believe, brings Him so much glory. I don't want to give to get any recognition. I don't want to give to get a gift back. What I want to give for is I want to give to get more of Him. And that's that blessedness, right? When, He talks about it's more blessed to give than receive. It's that, we say Baruch, but the Hebrew would say Baraha. And it's that entering into that flow and that cycle of giving where He's caring for us and we're caring for others with His care. And we're just reflections, right, of His love and His glory. And you can't touch that this side of heaven. You can't touch that joy of knowing that the God of the universe has literally reached through heaven to earth to say, I see you. I'm crying with you that you're going through this, but I have a secret this side of heaven that'll carry you. And I think that's what generosity is. And I would love to be the girl that tells you all the great ways and all the technical ways and all these things. But the only thing, if you ever know about me, is that you can mine for His joy because it is there. And He's offered it to every single one of us. And generosity, it's just the way He unlocks it.
Man, there's so much to unpack from what you just shared there. I want to step back a little bit to you were referencing Jacob wrestling with God, right? And that really hit for me. That was a very specific passage that God used for me in a pretty recent season. That idea of Jacob wrestling with God and saying, I will not let you go. Like, you look at everybody else coming to God and saying, like, you're falling on their knees and like, I should be a dead man. And here's Jacob not letting him go and say, I will not let you go until you bless me, and leaving with a limp. Like you said, like there's a wound that carries on in that joy. But, this entire conversation, there has just been an overflowing joy in everything that you share, despite many really profound seasons of loss. And something that I just kind of sense from the way that you talk about your relationship with God is that the level of joy that you know now would probably have not been possible for you to experience had you not been through the depths of suffering and loss that you've been through. And I'd love to just hear your thoughts on that. Especially, I'm thinking of somebody listening right now going through a season like that, maybe one of their, most challenging or darkest seasons that they've been through in a long time, and how God used that to show you this specific side of him that you kind of know much more deeply now.
Yeah. So I think the things that you learn in the dark, right? The dark side of grieving and in the shadow of the valley, those things about God, they're intimate. And the two most profound things I think he's shown me is, number one, he is enough. When I didn't have an answer or didn't have a provision or didn't know what treatment center to put them in, didn't know, some of them have overdosed and lived, but didn't know if for a period of time they were going to live. He says, I am, and he is enough. And he is whatever I am, whatever you need. And he's proven that to me. And I believe that he is enough. I believe he's more than enough. And I believe he is not a taker. And even in only having our son this side of heaven for 31 and a half years, God didn't take him. He's not a taker. He's a giver. For God so loved, he gave. And so forming a relationship with a God that I can believe with every fiber of my soul that he is not a taker. And in fact, he is the God of the overflow, that he is the God of immeasurably more. Even in loss, I have to adjust my perspective to his truth. And the perspective that we landed on, because I believe he is enough and he is everything we need, and he is the God of the overflow, is that he gave Christopher to us for 31 and a half years. And we had 3.5 years right before Christopher relapsed that were the best 3.5 years we had had with him as a family. He was sober. He was working his recovery. And I did not realize until after his death the amount of love and effort that took for him as an addict every day to show up in those 3.5 years. And so that was the gift. And so, yeah, as a mother, I could say, I want one more day, or God, why did you take him? But the truth is, God gave him to us in the first place as an adopted child. And then he gave us 3.5 years. I believe he gave us his best. And I believe God says every good and perfect gift is from him. And so when it wasn't God's best anymore, that was the days that were written in the book for Christopher. Christopher was a believer. Christopher had a lot of struggles, and Christopher was gay. And the pain I think that Christopher felt reconciling his faith and his sexual orientation, I realize now that the gift was he showed up every day in those 3.5 years sober, and he chose that. And so those are the things that I believe, is that God is enough, that he is not a taker, and that he is the God of the I am. He is, and you can fill that then for whatever you think you need. And that is who he is. And he is so good. And he is so loving. And I will tell you, losing a child, there is a special grace. There's a special anointing that he provides, because he knows he's the father that lost a son. And those are the things that I know. And so generosity becomes just a response to his goodness and to the belief that he is enough, and to the belief that he will be whatever we need. And it's actually a way to enter into that flow of care with him and to experience that absolutely overflowing joy of the presence of Jesus through the generosity, whether it's your time, your talent, your treasure, my two favorite add-ons, your relational ties, and your testimony, the things that you know because you've walked through them with the Lord.
Teri, you've mentioned these expressions of generosity a few times, and you've clearly stewarded your testimony in a way that is continuing to impact others. And specifically in this season, you get to do that through Women Doing Well. What has it meant to you to be able to share your story and just have that community of women around you?
It has been the biggest give back and the biggest joy bomb. I am a girl's girl, and I have been in women's ministry for over 40 years. And several years ago, when Women Doing Well was going through one of their versions, they would do these big city conferences. And I participated the first time through that. I had a table and invited, 10 or 12 people to attend with me. So I had exposure to them. And when I was sitting at that table, the Lord said to me, Teri, you will be a part of this leadership one day. And this was in 2016, I believe. And I had gotten this little Women Doing Well workbook, and I had brought women leaders. I had billed it to them as this day for them to, not focus on others, to focus on themselves. And we were supposed to take all these tests. We were supposed to find out our purpose. We were supposed to identify our passions, and we were supposed to get a plan. Well, we were running a little behind schedule that day, and we didn't get to all of them. And I got this like holy anger. And I was just mad. And I was like, I promised all these ladies that we would do these activities, and we're not getting through them. And so I said, Lord, this is not acceptable to me. And so then that was when he said, well, Teri, I'm going to give you an opportunity to change things. And I was like, absolutely not. I don't, Lord, I'm not interested. And I think it was a prideful moment of me to my friends. But aside from that, I walked away and I just said, no, I'm not going to do it. And then fast forward several years ago, I got back in contact with Women Doing Well. The Lord reminded me of what he had told me. And he said, Teri, I am enough. So I got back involved. And it has been incredible because I feel like it is a way for me to mine for joy and to share that with other women and to watch women catch the transformational joy of generosity, and also to see that God has a purpose for them and that their passions are not random, that he has a plan for those passions, and then to empower them with the confidence in him and the intimacy with the Lord that they can execute a generosity plan with their spouse. Many of them, if they don't have a spouse, if they're widowed, if they're divorced, if they're not married. We say at Women Doing Well, this great wealth transfer is coming to the world in 2030, and we'll have over 70% of the wealth in our possession. We say we marry it, we bury it, we make it, we divorce it, and we inherit it. And to me, I can't think of a greater purpose in my life than to invite women into this great journey of generosity with the Lord and this big adventure to partner with him and adjust their lives and walk with him in the joy as he loves so many people in the world through their generosity. So that's been my passion. And I love to facilitate because I love to watch women. And many of these women have deep, long years of relationship with the Lord. And just to watch them catch the joy that he's had for them through generosity, and just to watch them get to experience God maybe in a different way than they have known him. It's a joy rush. And I say I'm a joy junkie, but it's a high because you know that he is inviting that woman in and she'll never be the same in the very best way.
Teri, you mentioned both the Gathering and Women Doing Well as pretty, impactful, powerful communities in your life, in your journey, both as a receiver and as a giver. And I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on what makes a community especially powerful in fostering generosity, in encouraging and creating space, inviting, as you've said multiple times, someone into generosity. What makes a community especially powerful for that?
So I think it's the Holy Spirit has that secret sauce of vulnerability and joy. And the thing that I have learned is when you start talking about generosity, it's understood really quick. You're not talking about anything that you've done. You're really just talking and illuminating all God has done and invited you in to witness. So I think, especially for Women Doing Well, women are hungry to connect. And when you have prayerfully bathed a community in just invited God in and invited him, to express himself any way he brings him glory, women are anxious to connect with each other and with God. And generosity is not a topic. Most women in their, church communities or their hometowns, it's not a comfortable conversation because everyone's in a different place. But when you're together in a generosity community, you are hungering and thirsting for the Lord, and you are also experiencing the joy of the Lord. And so you want to give relationally, and you want to hear, and you want to grow. So it's a place of vulnerability. It's a place also where, I think it's okay to be, a little greedy. I want to know more. I want to hear another woman's experience with the Lord so that I can glean from that something the Lord has for me. The same with the gathering. I think when you're talking about families and generosity, it was so powerful to us to be mentored by families that were further down the road than us. And it was also powerful for us to see how God could put us together to give more, right? The synergy of maybe several women or several families coming together to give more. And we see that right now in a lot of Christian initiatives where we're collaborating. Multiple families are giving towards investing and, sex trafficking and things that alone we could each give to, but together we realize God is using, the collective body. So those are the things. The other thing I think is just the vulnerability of sharing your mistakes and sharing the victories in the Lord and people knowing you and being seen. And at Women Doing Well, I think one of my favorite values is that we value seeing a woman right where she's at. She doesn't have to do anything. She doesn't have to be anything. And because she's valuable to the Lord, she's valuable to us as a sister, and that's my favorite thing, because I think when you're going through so much pain and suffering, you feel invisible. You feel like God doesn't see you. You feel like everybody else is living their life and they don't see you. And it's a lie from the pit of hell, but it's still isolating. And so the power of inviting a woman and seeing her and listening to her and just giving her space to experience God and a laugh and another friend, to me, those are the secret ingredients that the Holy Spirit uses to, produce that joy. And then also when you're talking about generosity, like you cannot outgive God. So you already know the way in the kingdom economy that those communities are set up. You're going to be blessed beyond measure because that's just the way that God does it. And every year I come back from, our patron event, and I have 40 or 50 or 120 this year, new best friends. And we're texting throughout the year and loving each other and praying for each other. And it's a quickened community because the Holy Spirit has knitted our hearts together. And it's the same with the gathering. We have a couple, the very first gathering we sat down to, they're G5. And she's been a part of Women Doing Well for several years. But every time I see her, I cry because I think it all started with her and her husband. They were our first friends or whatever at the gathering. And God would just be so generous. And so I think in these communities, and we're a part of Generous Giving. We've been a part of, other NCF Georgia. And I think the quickening element of those giving communities is the Holy Spirit, just the joy that he gives and everyone's opportunities to give and sharing with each other. It just spurs each other on. And it is a secret joy of giving.
We have covered a lot of ground, and we're so grateful for your willingness to share some of your stories with us. But we'd love to hear what you're most excited about in the next 5 or 10 years.
Wow. Okay. So I have stepped into the chairman role for Women Doing Well. And I'm most excited to watch the Lord connect women to himself and to each other through Women Doing Well. I would love to see, and my prayer is that we have a cohort in every state or chapter, whatever you want to call it, of Women Doing Well in every state of America, because I feel like that sense of belonging that women have. And I think it would be, I just have this vision. God has given me this vision of like a national Women Doing Well conference where we're all coming together and we're getting to experience communally what we're experiencing individually in each of our states as we walk with God and with each other in generosity. So Julie will probably laugh at me, but that's my big dream. I'm a connector. And so I think the most powerful thing we can do is invite other people into our joy. I know for me, when we've walked through these years, and we'll always, having lost a child and having 2 other kids with significant mental health issues, we'll always have, things this side of heaven I wish I could change. I wish God would go ahead and heal. But I think that the thing that excites me is that the joy from generosity can outweigh that today. And so that's what I want to spread for other women. The other thing I'm looking forward to is my daughter, our oldest daughter and son-in-law, we do a lot with them. And so these children, we have 3 grandchildren, and we're really beginning to be intentional in the same ways we were with our kids to let our grandchildren catch generosity through us and to begin to go on mission trips with them and begin to see how God is crafting their hearts. So those are 2 areas in my life that I'm really excited to see. And I sense this anticipation that God is at work. And Chris and I always have an adventure. We just got back from Japan and we love church planning. So I am excited to see where God might use us in the world, to continue to bring the gospel and his love to others.
Well, it sounds like you will be plenty busy in the next 5 or 10 years. I'm excited to see what God has in store. As we get to the end of our episode, we like to leave some time for our Manager's Minute, just a practical suggestion for our listeners for how they can step into their role as stewards and manage God's wealth wisely. So, Teri, do you have a suggestion for our listeners today?
I do. And if it's okay, I want to be generous and give 3 suggestions. The first one is to read Theo of Golden. If you need to get a spiritual shot in the arm and a picture of the goodness of God and some joy, read Theo of Golden. It is definitely a generosity igniter. The next thing I would love to suggest is you go back through Henry Blackaby's Experiencing God. It's an oldie but a goodie, but I think so often we forget the very things that brought us to the feet of God, right? My husband and I do it every 5 years or whatever, just to remind us of who God is and how to orient our lives. And the last thing, our dear friend Boyd Bailey has a new book, and this book is one of the best books I've read on generosity. The Power of Generosity, Experiencing God's Amazing Abundance. I would encourage you, it's got a journal aspect to it. You could do it with your spouse. You could do it with a group of friends, but it's powerful and it will be transformational in your journey of generosity.
Well, thanks so much, Teri. This has been an amazing conversation. Thank you for just the intentionality of which you steward your story and for the vulnerability of sharing how God has really led you to the depth of joy that he has shown you that you now get to invite so many others into. So we're really grateful for you giving us your time today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for what you and Cody do with this podcast, because I believe it is a catalyst and I believe it's an igniter of joy for people that listen through their generosity.
Well, we certainly hope so. Thanks so much, Teri.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to the show, guys. If you want to find any references or links from today's show, you can always find them in our show notes at finishlinepledge.com/episode 186. And if you'd like to get in touch, we would love to hear from you. Just send us an email at hello@finishlinepledge.com. Now, as most of you know, on the Finish Line podcast, we are all about stories, seeing how God draws us into generosity over a lifetime. But sometimes these stories can leave us thinking, what's that next step look like for me? That's exactly why we've launched a whole new podcast called Applied Generosity, which explores the full landscape of the generous life across 7 different dimensions of generosity. Applied Generosity helps us make sense of the hundreds of stories we've shared on the Finish Line podcast to help you find that best next step. If you've been inspired by these stories and want to take things to the next level, check out Applied Generosity anywhere you listen to podcasts or at appliedgenerosity.com. That's all we have for today. We'll see you next time.